Hello. Our second political philosopher that we'll be looking at today is John Rawls. He's very different than Hobbes. He's a contemporary American political philosopher um, from the late 20th century. And what we'll be looking at with him is not so much his idea about basic human nature, although we will touch on that, but some decision-making tools that Rawls thinks is useful when we're thinking about what rules we want to have in order to have a just and fair society. So I want to tell you right now, we're only scratching the surface with Rawls. There is a whole lot to this man's political philosophy that we're just not able to cover. I'm going to focus on some of the main aspects of it that we could use as a decision-making tool. As I said, when we're thinking about using political philosophy as a way to determine our ideas about ethics and how that translates into social policy. Okay, so here's Rawls, 1921 to 2002. So he's been gone for a little while now, but he was a very well-loved figure in philosophy and political science, and a very prolific writer and thinker. And his main contribution to the area that we're looking at is his idea of justice as fairness. And what we mean by that is not that whatever is just is fair, but we can evaluate whether a system or a rule or a policy that we have is just by trying to figure out if we would arrive at that policy if we began from an initial situation that was fair. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. So what he wants us to think about, and what we're going to be thinking about for today, is which type of social contract is the most just. And his answer to that is the one that was created in a fair environment. So if we have a social contract that was developed by only an elite group of people that didn't represent all of society, or a group of people in which some people were privileged over others and the decision-making process got more votes than others, those would be examples of social contracts that were not created in a fair environment. So Rawls's idea of what this fair environment would be like is something that he calls the original position. This is a good example, and the ideal example for him, of a fair starting point. Like with Hobbes' state of nature, Rawls's original position is not literal. It's a hypothetical situation. It's a thought experiment that we're supposed to use to see if something that we see in front of us today is something that the people in this original position, this hypothetical situation, would endorse or not endorse. So again, he's not saying we need to create this situation in reality. It's just something to get us to think about when we're considering the fairness of a given set of policies. So in the original position, what we have is a group of people who are brought together to create a social contract, and then they have to actually enter, live in, participate in this society that they're creating. So they're personally invested in creating a society that they would actually then be involved in. It's not for other people, it's for them. So the people in the original position have certain characteristics, and this is going to get to Rawls' idea about human nature a little bit. He says they're rational, and they're mutually disinterested, and I'll define that. So a rational person is unwilling to gamble or take risks. The idea here is that a person in the original position would not want to create a society in which they would be taking a risk about their own role in that society. I wouldn't be willing to take a risk of being severely disenfranchised or a slave or in some other really bad state by creating a society in which I'm taking the risk of doing that, right? So the idea of being rational is we want to know what's going on. We're not willing to take a gamble on our own lives and the quality of them. Being mutually disinterested means that you're concerned primarily for yourself. It's not that you don't care about other people, but when you're thinking about the type of society that you want to create, you're primarily concerned about your own experience and what that will be in that society. So we're not particularly altruistic. We're not particularly interested in other people's well-being. It might be a nice added bonus if the society that I create also benefits others, but I'm mainly concerned with whether it's going to be good for me. So when we're thinking about rationality and we're thinking about Rawls's idea that rational people are not willing to gamble, the idea here is that rational people don't willingly put themselves in risky situations. So in that case, as I said, we wouldn't advocate as a rational person creating a society with huge discrepancies of benefits. Some people get a lot of benefits and other people don't, or huge discrepancies in burdens, where a lot of people have to bear the burden of, let's say, heavy taxation in society and other people don't. Because you don't know which category you would personally fall in. So this is going to be really important as we think about how much social discrepancy we're willing to tolerate in a just and fair society. So we wouldn't want to risk a society with a lot of minority or with any minority or marginalized groups, because we wouldn't want to be in that group, and it's not a risk or a gamble that we would be willing to take if we were in this original position. So a very crucial aspect of Rawls's original position is the idea of the veil of ignorance. What he says is, in order for this position to really be fair and a position of equals, the people in the original position don't know anything specific about them and who they're going to be once they are actually living in that society and living in that social contract. So any specific identifying characteristics about yourself, you don't know. That means things like how much money you make, your race, your sex, your sexual orientation, your intelligence is another one, right? We can add to this list. The idea being, if I know when I enter that society that I'm going to be a 41-year-old white female philosophy professor, I'm going to create a society that heavily favors 41-year-old white female philosophy professors. Philosophy is going to be the highest paying profession in the world. So in order to make it so that we don't slant the system in our favor, we have to be ignorant of all those identifying characteristics. So this is feeding then back into the idea that we're not willing to take risks. You don't know anything about yourself, about who you're going to be in that society, and you're not willing to take a risk of being in a marginalized or disenfranchised group. So these two things together are going to lead to certain principles of justice for Rawls that he thinks anyone in the original position would agree on. Any person who is rational, mutually disinterested, in other words, really motivated primarily to look out for themselves, not other people, and is operating behind this veil of ignorance, so which basically makes it impossible to slant society's rules in your own favor. Oh, any other identifying factors there? We just don't know anything that would allow us to favor ourselves. So the veil of ignorance is required for fairness because people are self-interested, because if I know my characteristics, I will of course try to construct a society that benefits me. So there are two principles of justice that Rawls talks about that he thinks would inevitably result from this original position. First is what he calls the equality principle. And this says that equal rights and duties should be available to everybody. So it's pretty easy to see why you would advocate this in the original position. You're not willing to gamble, so you wouldn't want to create a society in which only some people had rights and only some people had to uphold certain duties. You would want a situation in which everybody had the same rights and duties so that you wouldn't run the risk of being in the disenfranchised group. The more complicated of these two principles of justice is something that he calls the difference principle. So we know that in reality, in any society, as soon as actual real people are living in it and doing things in it, there are going to be differences. Some people will earn more money than others. Some people will actually have different aptitudes and abilities than others. There are going to be all kinds of differences that arise. So Rawls is not advocating forced equality. He's not advocating taking away certain benefits from others and giving them to other people. So we are allowed to have society in which there are lots and lots of differences. Differences is a good thing, and there are some differences that are definitely allowed to remain. So the equality principle, everyone enjoys the same rights, everyone has the same duties or obligations, and this arises, as I said, from our status as rational agents who don't want to gamble. The difference principle says that some discrepancies are going to exist, right? And we talked about these. There are going to be differences in power, wealth, social status, all kinds of other things. And these inequalities are okay under two conditions. First, they have to be tied to opportunities open to everybody. In other words, we can't say that only white males are allowed to be doctors, or only people over 60 years old are allowed to be the president of the United States. These things have to be based on opportunities that are open to everyone. And that doesn't mean that everyone is going to succeed, right? If we go back to the example of doctors, not everyone has the aptitude to get into medical school or to succeed in medical school. But as long as we don't put a rule in place that eliminates some people from even trying to go to medical school, then the discrepancy that arises in status and wealth and other things from having some people be physicians and other people have other professions is still okay. So the opportunity is there. It doesn't necessarily mean that the guarantee of success is there. So that's the first one. Inequalities are considered just if they're tied to opportunities open to everybody, and if these inequalities benefit everyone with the special attention to the least well off. In other words, there's got to be something about this inequality that is designed to help the least fortunate. So this is something that's going to be a little bit hard to wrap our minds around. So let's see if we can apply the difference principle a little bit. So here's an example of an inequality. Senators in the United States have more power than the average citizen. They have the power to make laws, to block laws, to endorse certain policies, things like that. So I think this is something we can all agree on. The question is this going to pass the test? This is an example of an inequality, and we have to figure out whether it would be okay under Rawls' theory. So we ask, does everyone have the opportunity to become a senator? Again, that doesn't mean that everyone's guaranteed success. It just means that we don't have any rules in place that say only a certain category of people get to try to be senator. So we do have an age restriction on this, but in general, we say the answer to that is yes, right? Everyone over a certain age has the opportunity to try to become a senator. Does this arrangement benefit society, especially the least well off? So the question that we can ask here is it good for the disenfranchised people in society, people who have less money, have fewer opportunities, is it good for them to have senators whose job it is to make laws and policies, or is it bad for them to do that? Well, if the senators are doing their job, right, which is to be a steward for the people and do things for the good of the electorate, then we could argue that this arrangement benefits society because those policies and laws, especially pertaining to programs like welfare and food stamps and things like that, are meant to address the needs of the least well-off in that society. Now, we could also argue against this, right, and say maybe in theory this is how it is in the United States, but if you look at it, not everyone has the opportunity to be a senator, only people with a lot of money to campaign. And it doesn't benefit society because they're not actually doing what they're supposed to do. So we might arrive at different answers to this question. Does everyone have an opportunity to do this? And we can apply this to anything, senator or something else, and whether this arrangement benefits society. And our answers to this might be different depending on whether we're talking about the way things are supposed to be in politics or the way things actually are in politics. Another example that we can look at is differences in taxation. This is another thing that a lot of people point to as, for some people, evidence of an unjust social discrepancy in the United States. So let's say we have this inequality. Very wealthy people pay far less in taxes than the average citizen. And let's say that that's as a percentage, right? They pay a far smaller percentage of their income in taxes compared to somebody like me who's just an average citizen. So we need to apply the same test there. Is this just? Well, does everyone have the same opportunity that the super wealthy do to use the same tax loopholes? Maybe, right? I mean, the tax loopholes exist, and the question is what rules we're talking about. Are they rules that only apply to billionaires, right? We don't know. We'd have to examine the loopholes. And then, does this arrangement benefit society and specifically the least well-off? This is probably going to fail this second test because the only people who benefit from this would be the billionaires, the ultra-wealthy themselves, right? The least well-off are actually bearing the burdens of this if the very wealthy pay fewer taxes than least well-off. So this, because of this second question specifically, is something that we'll probably have to say fails the test of applying Rawls's difference principle. So in Rawls's ideal society, which would be a society that is the most just possible, it would be based on a fair distribution of benefits and burdens. Any discrepancies would have to benefit the least well-off, and it can't be skewed to the advantage of any particular group. It doesn't necessarily have to be a group that depends on innate characteristics like skin color or intelligence or sex or gender. It could be something that has to do with income like we saw with the wealthy. So when we're thinking about Rawls, what I want you to do with this, especially as we're leading into the next part of the class where we're going to be talking about applied ethics, is think about whether certain proposed policies on issues that we're going to be tackling next, issues like euthanasia, for example, the death penalty and other issues like that, whether the policies that we have in place would pass this test. Now, you don't necessarily have to accept Rawls's idea of the ideal society, but it's an interesting tool to use to see whether we have a society that we would want to live in if we didn't know who we would be in that society, if we might have to take a gamble in order to make sure that we weren't the ones suffering the burdens of that society. So think about that and mainly focus for studying for the exam on how you could apply these two decision-making tools to a particular issue. Make sure you're able to understand and explain the idea of the original position and specifically the veil of ignorance and why it's an important aspect of that original position.